So if you're like me and Inuyasha holds a dear place in your heart, then you'd be surprised to hear there's something else that essentially came before the Inuyasha as you know it. Picture Inuyasha and Kagome, but generations older and a slightly darker, less popularized 80s anime short, and you have Fire Tripper, a story about a modern high school girl in Japan, uniform and all, who time travels back into the Sengoku era, where she meets a young soldier. The anime short by Rumiko Takahashi was published in August 1983 and was later adapted into an anime OVA as the first of the Rumik World series. For those of you who are fans of Inuyasha, you'll find some comfortable and entertaining familiarity in the classic Rumiko Takahashi-esque themes within Fire Tripper. I have to admit though, Fire Tripper explores quite a few more controversial themes than Inuyasha does, and is a bit trippier and hard to grasp. For those of you who are currently watching Yashahime as well, you might find it interesting that Takahashi stated in a recent interview that Rin and Sesshomaru's relationship is actually a canon of what she had originally written in Fire Tripper. In literature, the term canon is used to distinguish between the original works of a writer who created certain characters or settings, in this case a relationship, and their later works that take up the same relationship, character, or setting. And this is because Fire Tripper explores a love that forms between a non-biological older brother or caretaker and younger sister type of relationship. Well, kind of, and I'll explain more about that in just a sec. And a lot of the controversy that stems from the Rin and Sesshomaru relationship comes from the fact that Sesshomaru at several times gave off the impression that he was in a similar fatherly caretaker type of role as opposed to a romantic one. And their age gap as well as Rin's childlike character furthered this impression. In Fire Tripper, we see a similar theme, but it plays out in a very unique way. So in Fire Tripper, the main character, Suzuko, who is a high school girl in modern Tokyo, much like Kagome, but actually appearance-wise more closely resembles Sango, lives a normal life but has lingering memories of being trapped in a fire when she was a little girl. She takes care of her neighbor's child named Shuhei, who just had appendix surgery, and one day when they're walking home, a nearby tank explodes, and right before she dies in the explosion, she, hand in hand with Shuhei, miraculously time travels back to the Sengoku era of feudal Japan, where she meets Shikumaru, who initially saves her life and brings her back to his village. There, she discovers that Shikumaru has a younger sister named Suzu, and the two spend several days together adjusting Suzuko to life in the feudal era. One day, Suzuko notices Shuhei's red striped shirt, and Suzuko runs off in a panic, realizing that she must have brought Shuhei back with her in time. She frantically searches for him with the help of Shikumaru, but she is unable to find him. And throughout this process, we see some scenes that are very reminiscent and nostalgic of Inuyasha. Watching some of these scenes in Fire Tripper almost felt like I was watching some altered form of Inuyasha in a different dimension. Nonetheless, Suzuko and Shikumaru bond over time, and Shikumaru plans to marry Suzuko. One evening though, all hell breaks loose when the village is invaded, and it is during this event that Suzuko is able to piece together several important things. During the invasion, Suzu, Shikumaru's little sister, is trapped in a fire, and Shikumaru is unable to save her. Suzuko also manages to save Shikumaru's life by time traveling back with him to the modern era, several hours before the explosion occurred. That's when she realizes that her ability to time travel is triggered by fire, thus the title of the film. But more importantly, she realizes that she is in fact Suzu, and this part is a little bit hard to wrap your mind around at first. But essentially, that's why she had those memories of burning in a fire when she was little, and it also explains why her parents found her in feudal-era clothing, stranded by a lake one day, and took her in, allowing her to grow up in the modern era. Suzuko also brings Shikumaru back to her room to tend to his wounds, and this part really freaked me out because of the resemblance between Kagome's room back home and Suzuko's room in this scene. As she's treating Shikumaru's wounds, she notices a scar on his appendix, the same one that Shuhei had after his appendix surgery. At this moment, she realizes that Shikumaru is actually a grown-up Shuhei. When Suzuku time traveled with Shuhei upon the explosion, the two got separated mid-time travel, and Shuhei actually ended up being thrown back several years earlier than Suzuko, where the villagers found him and took him in. Thus, he grew up in the feudal era. Realizing that she and Shikumaru are not biologically related, The two return to the site of the explosion and time travel back to the Sengoku era. At this point, the story comes to an end as Shikamaru tells the village to begin arranging the marriage. There are a lot of additional details and visuals that are incredibly interesting that I didn't include in this quick summary, so I highly recommend that you watch this 15-minute film. At this point, you can probably see how Fire Tripper served in many ways as a preliminary blueprint of sorts for Inuyasha, albeit it's definitely a much more experimental film with a few vague plot holes and some questionable concepts. However, the major differences lie in the characters and the plotline, which for Inuyasha is heavily reliant on folklore, magic, and action. The romance arc, though, still more or less echoes each other, although in Inuyasha it is much more gradual, comedic, and frankly, relatable. Both romance arcs, however, have an element of slow burn to it. Now, let's pause and look at Shikamaru and Inuyasha and Suzuko and Kagome. Inuyasha and Shikamaru are far different, besides sharing traits of roughness, initially at least, and bravery. Because this is an anime OVA under 50 minutes, there's hardly any room for character development. Whereas in Inuyasha, one of the most important and notable aspects of the show is the character development, as well as the development of relationships between the characters. Watching the later seasons of Inuyasha makes the initial episodes in season 1 feel weird and foreign. So, Shikamaru and Fire Tripper, though sharing a similar role and character archetype as Inuyasha, minus the half-demon backstory, is still far different than Inuyasha, whose character is largely dynamic while Shikamaru's is static. Interestingly enough, though, I really believe that Shikamaru served as an inspiration for Koga more than anything, as we can see in his appearance and what he wears, his personality, especially the way he shows a very direct affection for Kagome rather than the subtle ways that Inuyasha does. And also in Inuyasha, we see Koga to be a relatively static character as well. So maybe this is what inspired the Koga, Inuyasha, and Kagome love triangle that we are all so familiar with in Inuyasha. And as for Suzuko and Kagome, we can see major differences between these two characters, as Suzuko clearly serves as inspiration for Kagome in terms of setting, role, and appearances, notably the school uniform and the lore of being a high school student with ability to time travel. We can see how Suzuko is a much less complex character than Kagome, whose strong will and determination are key components of her character. Suzuko, on the other hand, doesn't display many character traits beyond the ordinary in the duration of the film. However, kindness and compassion and the tendency to protect and take care of others is still very much present and familiar in both Kagome and Suzuko. Another clear parallel to Inuyasha is when we see Suzuko deciding which world to leave behind, much like Kagome in the final act, and ultimately choosing the feudal world, understanding that that's the one that they truly belong in. We see in Fire Tripper the similar hardships and guilt that both Suzuko and Kagome felt towards leaving their families behind, and the moment where they realize their parents acknowledge and understand that they will one day have to leave them. Now, some of the scenes from this part eerily reminded me of Your Name, or Kimi no Na wa, another great anime film by Makoto Shinkai, especially the part where she transported back to before the explosion and realizes in a frenzy that she has to save Shuhei, yelling at him not to go to school that day. Makoto Shinkai drew some of his inspiration from Ranma 1/2, which is another manga adapted into an anime by Takahashi, which explains the switching genders aspect of Kimi no Na wa. One thing that I never mentioned earlier in the video is the bell that's repeatedly shown, heard, and mentioned throughout the film. Again, reminding me of Kimi no Na wa reminds me of the bracelet that Mitsuha gave Taki in the movie, serving as an object that connects them despite the time that is separating them. If you guys haven't seen Kimi no Na wa, I also highly recommend that you guys watch that. But now, to go back to where we began, after seeing its striking resemblance in some aspects at least, to Inuyasha, I'm pretty surprised I stumbled upon this work so late. And if you too have never heard of Fire Tripper, then I'll say it will come with all the familiarity and nostalgia of Inuyasha back in the 2000s. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and definitely comment down below. What are your thoughts on Fire Tripper?